Thank you very much for that, Jane, and thanks again to Astrolabe Wines, who are our lovely wine sponsor this evening, and I'm sure you're all enjoying a glass. Welcome to this session of the Marlborough Book Festival. I think it's going to be a fantastic one. I do have a couple of points of housekeeping. There will be time for questions at the end, and there will be book signings afterwards for about half an hour. And please, if you haven't already, turn your cell phones off or onto silent. We have two amazing writers here. We're incredibly lucky to have two people of such a great calibre to talk to us this evening. Tom is have you found your phone, Tom?
I've just been making certain of it.
Tom is a ridiculous polymath whose achievements are really far too numerous to list here. He's a former listener journalist, a Dominion Post cartoonist, a playwright and a screenwriter. And he has relentlessly mined his family history for the purposes of writing. He's written plays about both his mother and his father, and his family obviously plays a starring role in his new memoir, Drawn Out, which we have here. And Diana will also be well known, I'm sure, to many of you. She's been a journalist for many years at The Listener, where she's carved out a particular niche as a world-class TV reviewer. Her first book, Driving to Treblinka, is an incredibly moving account of her quest to find out what really happened to the father that she left behind as a teenager in Canada, and who was supposed to join them, but never did. So I guess can we start perhaps for those who haven't read the books to give a little bit of context, just a little bit about your childhoods and the role of family in those. Diana, do you want to start? You were 13, I think, when you left Canada to come to New Zealand. Can you explain, I guess, how that happened?
Yes. Well, it's a long story. My father was a Polish Holocaust survivor who survived by jumping off a train on the way to Treblinka, an extermination camp, where the rest of his family, I think there were three survivors out of a family that I'm told the extended family was over 100 people. So he was one of three. He hid out in the forest and was lucky enough to survive. It was miraculous, really. Every step of his survival, the odds were, very much against living for another 5 minutes, really. So, and so he went to Sweden and then made his way to America, where he fell out with his brother, brother who got out before the war, as happened not infrequently in these families. They couldn't hold together afterwards for reasons we might talk a bit about later. But and so he took himself off to Vancouver with help from his brother, who continued to support him financially, where he met my mother, who was on her OE from New Zealand. She was about 29, I think, at the time, and had been engaged to an American during the war, but he got appendicitis and got shipped out, and she never heard from him again. So that was that. And she did say later on that after that, she got sick of dating guys whose idea of a good time was to vomit behind the dance hall. So she went to Vancouver, ended up working for my father in his textile importing business, and he arrived round at her boarding house with a bouquet of flowers and his impeccably tailored English textiles, and clicked his heels, kissed her hand. So they got married after.
Who could refuse?
After he ensured that she was pregnant first, because he was 10 years older and he'd been through what he'd been through, and he wasn't messing around by that stage. So he wanted to be sure he was going to start a new family. So and so I grew up there until I was 13, when things spectacularly began to fall apart. He was increasingly ill, though we didn't, as children, really know what was going on. And even my mother, I don't think, really knew what was going on. So her family, big Catholic family in Auckland, and mounted a rescue mission, basically, and sent tickets. Didn't occur to me to wonder at the time if they'd sent one for my father, but they certainly sent one for her and 3 children, so we took off. He was meant to follow, and that's what we expected to happen for quite some time. But
when did you come to the realisation, I guess, that wasn't going to happen?
Well, I think I was very thick, actually. And the thing was, nothing. When I look back now, he was never talked about by my mother's family. You know, his name was just not mentioned. And I've seen in letters I wrote to my friend in Vancouver that I went to quite some circumlocutions not to mention him. So I must have, on one level, realised things were not going well in that regard. And then eventually my mother met a man. She was working at Bisthew Wine and Spirits in Takapuna, locally known as Piss Spew Wine and Spirits. And so Stu, my stepfather, appeared, though they didn't marry for some time. And what are the odds? He was from Vancouver. So people would say, so is this your father from Vancouver? And I would say, well, no. And it just became a nightmare, really, from which I think I just retreated by trying not to think about it. But yeah, so this is why, this many years later.
You've come back to it.
Yeah.
I mean, what about you, Tom? You, you grew up in Fielding. Your father called you egghead, and not as a term of endearment. You ended up with a munched leg in a lawnmower accident, and ended up with calipers. I mean, that sounds like your childhood with the rollicking time.
I have a natural physical grace. In some ways, our stories are inverted. My father went out to New Zealand first, before Mum and my twin sister followed him. He was working in Shannon Airport in Southern Ireland. He was in the RAF. He was in the bar in Munich when he saw a bunch of New Zealand Pākehā beat up a German barman for calling a Maori a monkey. No. And my father was terribly impressed with this solidarity displayed by the white New Zealanders supporting their Maori comrade. This is in Germany, which had lost the war for the worst racism on record. So they absolutely smashed the bar up, and British military policemen came running, and Dad said, and the New Zealanders kicked the snot out of them as well. and then they said, and they strolled next door into another bar and kept drinking. He said, it was so fucking impressive. I said, I'm going to that country. And he fell in love with New Zealand before he even got here. And when he stepped ashore, he loved it. Absolutely loved New Zealand, was no intention of ever going back, and most of his mates were tangata whenua. But he went whistling happily on his Army Union motorbike, went down to Southern Ireland to work on the building of Shannon Airport, met my mum, who was absolutely innocent but glamorous, and Mum said I let him thread me needle. And I was in a theatre in Wellington, and Mum was closer to the actor than you people in the front row are, and he was naked as a Dean Parker play, and he was naked with his willy. And Mum leant forward like this, and I was, oh, God. And Mum turned to me and said quite loudly, I've only ever had your father's penis inside me. And they had all these extra kids, but our father... And Mum said, another rude story I have to tell. We were sitting around a table at my house once, and Mum said, oh, I didn't want ye. Oh, I cried tears when I had... She went round the whole table. I ran a hot bath and drank a bottle of gin, hoping I'd miscarry when I heard I was carrying you. And we're all going, Mum, Mum. Didn't want any of us. And she said, I stuffed myself with toilet paper, but your father's sperm always got through.
Should have been on an Eater ad, obviously.
And apparently it's a very poor form of contraception. So she chased him out on the boat. Me and Sue were just twins. And when we arrived, a story I told this morning, we just never bonded.
Why do you think that was? Do you think he resented you for curtailing his freedom, or...?
He never talked to me about it, but he told Brother Michael, and there's the other, I think Diana will probably, I'm sure it's the same experience. Your parents, each child has a different parent, unbelievably different. So he told Michael stuff he never told me, and he was quite excited to see meet Mum coming out on the boat. And he got the pilot in Auckland to take him out on the boat when they took the boat up the Rangitoto Channel, and it was the Tamaraa. And Mum didn't know, Mum didn't expect to meet him for another hour. So he told Michael, he said, I went to the cabin, oh, Jesus Christ, your mother, she had her teeth in a jar by the door, and she was wearing... He didn't know Mum had dentures, and Mum had false teeth out. She was wearing a nightie, no makeup, hair in curlers. Sue apparently tottered towards him and held her hand out. I don't know if we could speak or anything, and I just crapped my pants, and that was it. There was no, even on his deathbed, he was, bitter about me to the end, and I did nothing wrong. But particularly, I was a well-behaved, conscientious kid, but I cried easily. So he would, if I walked into a room, I could see that I just pissed him off instantly. So
he never put a name to it, or.
I'm sure you've got it. I've got stacks of letters from people who writing to me about the book, and some of them are writing to me about my father. And one guy said he was going back to Fielding to stay with his father, and he said we were all terribly proud that you were Tom Scott from Fielding in the Listener. And the whole bar was all very proud of you, except for your father. And he said, your father would say, you'll amount to nothing. It's a flash in the pan. And he compared me to a singer called Lee Grant from Palmerston. Remember him? He's like Lee Grant. He'll be gone next week. And he was desperately hoping and praying that
it didn't work out.
And I don't know why, but I forgive that generation everything now, because what they saw and endured was shocking. So you have to be tolerant.
I mean, families are such personal and intimate and inevitably sometimes fraught things. Why write about them, Diana?
I ask myself that quite often. I think out of denial and ignorance, really. I think I always wanted to try and find out, obviously, and that grew towards the end of my mother's life. I sort of really started trying to find out what had happened, and I grilled her, she was always, to do her credit, up for it, but she would always cry, and so that was hard. So I think, I probably maybe didn't push as hard as I should. And her cousin was a lawyer who'd helped her a bit. I went to him, are there any records? Because I had a memory of being told that he died in Ontario. We couldn't find a death certificate. We still can't find a death certificate. So it seemed like every door I tried to open was shut. But I wanted to find all that, and definitely wanted to do that. Thought I'd write it all down for the family sometime. But then Mary Varnum from Our Press, she'd rung me a while back, earlier actually, and said, is there anything you'd like to write about? And I probably threw a couple of ideas at her and said, no. And we just left it at that. And, it didn't occur to me to say, maybe I'll write about that. The denial or the weirdness. I might have said, well, I have got a story. But eventually I wrote a little bit about it in The Listener, very obliquely. I'd occasionally approach the subject quite obliquely. And she said, oh, you've got a strange family. She rang up another time and said, would you like to write about that? And coming at the moment that it did, when I was really trying to find out, I just felt like I couldn't say no, because to be offered that, it's a responsibility in a way. And all I needed was a sign someone was interested, because I had written these earlier stories a couple of times, and you get some lovely feedback and people, but, some of my male colleagues would sort of pat me on the head and say, good, you got that out of your system, And so I just didn't think anyone else would be particularly interested. So all I needed was her to say, yes, I want to read about that. And then I set off on it.
I mean, having gone through the process and put it out there, would you do it again?
There were moments when I wouldn't. I mean, just at the moment, that's what I think obviously, I would, I'd have to do it anyway. But I think I would have been a lot more worried if I'd known. I think the minute it was sent off out of my hands irrevocably, I had a complete meltdown. I was like, when you've pressed send on something, some terrible email that you shouldn't have sent, I need it back. Because it was very personal, and it involved other people, most of who I quote or anything were involved,
I want to come back to that in terms of that process.
Of doing that. But there's inevitably the odd one who didn't want to be involved and didn't seem to much like the idea, and And also, suddenly the responsibility of it. And also the paranoia, I had always had this sort of low-level paranoia, and I think I'm putting it out there that all my children have this heritage. And in the course of writing it, of course, the world was beginning to change in a not entirely pleasant way, vis-a-vis anti-Semitism and strange rulers who were doing crazy things. Won't mention any names, but... No. So I think, there's always been that little low-level paranoia, which is one level of it as well. And you're thinking, okay, it's all out there now. And mostly it's been okay. I've had, like my mother's family, I think anyone who reads the book will know that they were spectacularly disinclined to talk about anything that ever happened in that family. My grandmother had 8 children, and 2 of them, one died in her 30s and one died in her 50s. And their names were never mentioned again.
Wow.
Such was her inability to deal with such situations. So, to then do this, and, I don't think it occurred to me that they would read it, And 2 aunties did talk to me, and I remember sent them the book, and I didn't hear anything. Eventually I rang, and they were okay about it. And when one of them said, "I'm glad you wrote it," I sent her the most gigantic bouquet of flowers out of sheer relief. She rang and said, "Those flowers, what?" I was just so relieved. But then I met another cousin at a reading at Takapuna Library, and she just sort of came up and said coolly, "Well, it always was a story, wasn't it?"
Oh,
and that's all she said. Oh, so, but she at least gave me a hug and was speaking to me. So, but I think I just hadn't, because I think even as a journalist, I've operated in that way. If you really thought very hard about what you're doing and the possible repercussions, I would find it paralyzing. So I think I've learned a certain way to dissociate from
It's
it.
interesting. Tina Macdonald sort of said that earlier a little bit about to what extent you ask permission, and at the end you have to ask yourself permission.
And I've spoken to sterner souls than me, Daniel Mendelsohn, who I mentioned in the book, who's a great writer and classicist and TV reviewer and general Tom Scottian sort of person who does everything well. He was at a writers' festival. I interviewed him and talked to him, but he was also at a writers' festival and in a memoir panel sort of thing. And another writer was asked, "Oh yes, I showed it to every member of my family, and if they wanted changes," and they said, "And how about you, Daniel?" And he just said, "Nah, it's my story, and tough, I'm telling it." And I thought, "Ooh, I'd like to be able to think like that." But in the end, you have to be a bit ruthless. I think there's a level you can't let that, or you wouldn't do it.
I mean, what about you, Tom? Why did you decide to write about family? I mean, as you say, you've written plays about both your mum and your dad, and
I thought the time was right to have the entire memoir field covered this year. I thought I'd sweep all before me and win, and then bloody Diana Wichtel turned up. And her book is stunning. It's beautiful. If anyone doesn't own a copy, you have to. You'll cry. You'll laugh. It's absolutely exquisitely written, and it's important because it shows that 12,000 miles away from the darkest chapter in human history, it's still rippling. There's still shadows. And someone asked Chairman Mao what he thought the impact of the French Revolution had been, and he said, "It's too early to tell." And I think that's true of the Holocaust. The Holocaust, it's still the most devastating thing. The use of industry, the use of the latest technology.
I think we were talking about your family, Tom.
No, it's very similar. Oh, well, I think my father was a strange way. Well, I wouldn't have ended up here if it hadn't been for the war. But in terms of how did I feel about writing the book, in our house, it's just the dinner table, everyone's talking at once. Not when my father, when he was there, it just went silent. He'd walk in and it would just absolutely go silent. He'd come in drunk almost every night, and he would say "Did anyone ring for me?" "No, Dad." "The Pope?" "No." "Did perchance the Pontiff himself ring for me?" "No, Dad." "Frank Sinatra?" "No, Dad." "The Duke of Argyll?" I was staggered at the list that would go on, and Sammy Davis Jr. "Did he, Sammy Davis Jr. ring for me?" And this would go, we'd go, "No, Dad, no, Dad, no, Dad." Then he'd turn to my mother and say, "Christ, you're ugly. Put your teeth in, woman. They are in. Take them out, that might help." So that went on every night. almost every night. Some nights he would have give his liver a rest. But when he was out of the room, there was just a babble of people talking. And if my sister's at a dinner party, Sister Sally is funny, Sister Jane is funny, Sister Sue is funny, Michael was a hoot. Robbie's the only quiet one, really, Brother Rob. So we're all babbling away, and they suited the family tree. You talk about aunts and uncles. We never had a single relative, as if we were just arose spontaneously. And we never father never acknowledged birthdays. I've never seen a picture of his family. Mm. And Mum had a couple of smudge photographs of hers. The Scots just arrived as a random mutation in the Manawatu. So we have no whakapapa, no backstory. Obviously we do. Michael went back to Northern Ireland once to meet my father's family. And my father was sort of unemployed and out of work or whatever. But he was obviously intelligent. But Mickey went back. Mickey was staggered. There were judges and lawyers and doctors on his side of the family. He was the one disappointment. And his older brother, Paddy, said to Michael, "Is your father still a sarcastic bastard?" Mickey said, "Yes, I think that sums him up very well." And that's the only contact we've ever had with that side of the family.
So, I mean, you had to find a backstory for Daylight Atheist. So how much of that is invented and how much of it is
He told Michael
true?
a story. Again, Michael, he shared things with Michael. There was an aunt who was barren, and he was from a large Protestant family in Northern Ireland, and his family sent my father off to live with her for a few years, and he really resented it. And I had a Maori friend. I put an ad in the paper. Pākehā needs Maori friend, and so I can bring it up at parties. And this person was adopted out to live with an aunt, and I said, and I said, "You must have fucking hated that. The rest of your family at home, and you're off living with someone else." I said, "I don't believe that bullshit. That the extended family is the same thing as your own family." And he said, "No, it was terrible. It was terrible. Why am I here? Mum and Dad and my brothers and sisters are laughing 10, 15, 20 miles away." So my father hated it. And in the Daylight Atheist, I kind of went back into that and sort of gave that as possibly an excuse for how we behaved.
I mean, Diana, you wrote of your father, "In my narrative, he was a passive victim, but on this sort of voyage, everything you think you know can turn out to be wrong." Who was the father that you thought you knew when you started this process, and how did that change?
Well, yeah, I think obviously to me it was just this completely tragic story of a person who'd been destroyed piece by piece, which it is. That's not untrue. It is. And I think I can remember the moment at which it sort of hit me that he had lost everything twice, every single thing, entire family, everything he owned, everything twice. And we were implicated in one of those times. It's the most horrific realization. For which there is just no escape from the guilt. So I just, I'm not one of those people that says, you've got to get rid of the guilt, because I think there just isn't an escape from it. But I think in the process of doing this, of course, you find out more. I have a cousin, actually that quote comes out of the reading I'm going to do, and I had a cousin, my late cousin Joe, who I didn't discover for family weird reasons. Why didn't I know about him until 2006? And he was 17 when the survivors came back. And so I learnt from him some things about what my father was like and, little bits about what had happened. And but it was more the third generation, my generation are hopeless. We're all scarred and wrecked and barely able to talk about these things amongst ourselves. My brother and I can, but it's hard. It's hard, and it's affected everyone differently. But the third generation come along, and they hear these stories. Why didn't you ever tell me? And I think I thought I had. You do that in families. You think you thought you talked about it. And I mentioned that in the book, my grandchild looking at a photo and saying, "Who's that?" And me kind of saying, "Oh, it's your changing the subject quite quickly, because I think, how do I go into this with this little gorgeous 6-year-old looking up at me with his hopeful, optimistic little face. Well, you know, listen to this story. But my daughter and my nieces, when they pushed me really hard, like my daughter will say she bullied me to keep going, because I'd say, oh, I can't find anything. And they'd say, it's ridiculous, you cannot not know where your father is buried. You can't. It's just absurd, and it's not good enough, you know. And so they would push and shove. But also they had this view of him. They saw the side that he had survived something unspeakable. What kind of a person must he have been to be able to do that? He'd survived living in the woods. He'd survived, tried to start again. So they have this different picture of him, which I think I'll mention, you know, if we do the reading.
Yeah, would you want to do the reading now?
Oh, okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so they've been an absolute, you know, for me. Nothing can change the past, and it's way too late for my father, but it's extremely comforting to know that his memory is carried in this different way by that generation. So. Yeah, so this is about when I first started talking to Joe, who was in his late 70s when I finally got to know him. Joe tells me what I most want to know, the story of my father. Ben Wichtel was a young, very athletic man, he writes to me. They were en route to Treblinka, which was not a concentration camp, but a killing centre about 2 hours north of Warsaw. There, the Nazis established gas chambers to kill the Jews. Ben Wichtel jumped off the train. The trains had little windows with barbed wire, but my father managed to get out. He must have been very thin to do that, Joe says. He lived in the forest until the end of the war. I'll learn from his post-liberation registration card and from a list made when he was liberated that he was found with partisans and others who'd escaped from ghettos and from the Majdanek concentration camp near Lublin. Did he fight? I asked Joe. Of course he fought, says Joe. He wouldn't have survived if he didn't fight. Joe tells me that after the war, Uncle Si searched and searched for family members, but after he found Ben, the reunion in New York did not go well. Your father came to my house with a guitar, which was the wrong thing to do, by the way, Joe says. He looked bohemian, not what was expected. He looked merry. I can't explain it, said Joe. He looked fine. He didn't look like he had a problem in the world. Everybody pleaded with him to stay in New York, and everything would be fine. They would take care of him, because he wasn't all put together, you know. If you get out of the ghetto and all this crazy running around, you don't expect to be perfectly stable. Jumping off the train, living like an animal for 3 years with a little terrorist group who ran around and tried to knock off Germans and steal things to survive. I had somehow imagined my father just hidden in a box under the ground until liberation. But of course that never could have been true. He was young, strong, smart, and he had to eat. He had to live. He had to fight. As my daughter Monica will put it, that's some inglorious bastard's shit. So what did my father have to do to survive? I might have been frightened by his rages, but I'd known him as a gentleman opposed to violence. In my narrative, he was a passive victim, but on this sort of voyage, everything you think you know can turn out to be wrong. To Joe, he was maddeningly stubborn. Why the hell didn't he stay in New York? It didn't make sense 50 years ago. It doesn't make sense today. Everyone tried to persuade him to stay. Uncle Si was making a lot of money. He made your father a wonderful offer, Joe says. And he goes on to say about his mother, Sabina, my father's aunt, who also got out in the 20s. My mother pleaded with him in Yiddish. He was going so far away. It wasn't around the corner. He would pay attention to no one. Your father was a very handsome, musically talented and well-spoken man, all assets that would benefit him. Our family didn't understand his move far off to Canada. On the positive side, Joe says, if Ben hadn't gone to Vancouver, he wouldn't have met your mother, and you and I wouldn't be talking now. Uncle Si, who'd supported my father so far, arranged to send money every month. Joe understands what war can do. He served in Korea in the 1950s, an experience that affected him deeply. He spent years of his life researching and teaching about what happened to our family and to all the Jews of Nazi-occupied Europe. Every time we talk, he says, God, how I hate those Nazi bastards. His anger remains white-hot for his aunts and uncles and their children, for my grandmother Rakela, our great-grandmother Brandla, and for the survivors. Your dad went through hell and back and never recovered from the Holocaust. He ran away from his Jewishness, his heritage, his family. After my father left his aunt's house in New York, Sabina said something that made an impression on 17-year-old Joe. Please forgive my terrible Yiddish. Is a krank mensch. He's a sick man. When she heard years later that my father was dead, she believed he'd killed himself. The things Joe has told me suggest there was an unbridgeable gulf between the family members who, during the war, had been helpless and distraught, but safe in America, and those who turned up afterwards, having just walked out of hell. Joe says there's no point trying to figure out why my father didn't stay with what little family he had left. You as a daughter, you can go backwards and try and figure it out, but you won't. I was present, and I can't figure it out, and I'm pretty smart. We can't undo this. But to undo it is what I want. I want there to be a why. On the train to Treblinka, my father saw a tiny window he could squeeze through. He jumped down into the snow. When he and Paul got to America, that's his uncle Paul, who was one of the other survivors, they faced the question, what about the others? Joe tells me Sabina was angry that Paul arrived with a few family diamonds still sewn into the lining of his coat. He said she had a guilt complex about leaving Poland and having almost her entire family killed. She was critical of him for not taking care of their mother. My father, too, may have felt judged for not saving his mother. Maybe he felt he needed to take to his heels and again run for his life.
Beautiful, thank you. I mean, what about you, Tom? Were you looking for a why? Was that part of the
When
motivation?
Dinah was saying that, there's a line in the Primo Levi book, there is no why in Auschwitz. Yeah, one of my favourite Beatles songs is Tell Me Why. Maybe when I heard the story from Michael about my father going off to live with his aunt, but I don't feel guilty. I mean, you've taken all of World War II on your shoulders, and I not 99%. I don't feel bad. I don't feel guilty. I feel sorry for my father and sorry for my mother, but I'm not responsible for anything they did. I'm absolutely, totally responsible for everything I've done, but not for what other people have done. Sometimes you contribute. So I wasn't searching for a why. I just knew when you were sitting down. I remember sitting in when I was a vet student where people were sitting around talking about their tough childhoods and stuff, and we had to cancel our trip to Switzerland this year. We couldn't go skiing because Dad had some stuff. You go, oh, for fuck's sake, and sitting in school, and people would open their school lunch boxes, and they'd have, some mothers they'd peel the orange all the way around, perfectly, and they'd have beautiful lunches and stuff. And story I told this morning, and on Mufti Day, it's Fielding Ag, you didn't have to wear a uniform. For the third form and the fourth form and the fifth form, I had to wear my school uniform, and it was the only clothes I had. And the only other people who arrived on the school bus in school uniform, all the other kids tumbled off in jeans and jackets and hoop skirts and cardigans and stuff, looking really lovely. It was me, little Tommy Scott, and the Maori kids. And I wanted to explain how that happened.
Was there a moment in your childhood at which you realised this is not a normal family?
Yeah, well, there was a wealthy family up the road called the Ogles in Kimbolton Road. They had a fantastic house that had a circular driveway, had a grass tennis court. They had a lounge so posh no one went into it ever. And they had another lounge, it's the family room, they listened to the radio. They had a kitchen with a big table and a walk-in pantry. I always associated a walk-in pantry with luxury. They had a walk-in chiller with meat hanging from hooks and stuff. And I'd go up the road, and I told Mrs. Ogle stories from home about Mum painting. The lino was all worn on the floor in the bathroom, brown lakes where the lino had worn out. So there's a high tide mark of worn lino. Then there's a deep ocean of the timber coming through. And Mum got test paint pots from Dulux and got the old man's shaving brush and dipped the shaving brush into the test pots of paint. And there's a horrible pastel pink green and pastel pink, pastel greens and pinks on the floor. And for some reason, Mum just put the brush back in, and my father said, "Who the fuck has been in it?" And Mum denied all knowledge, and he was standing on the proof. and I'd go up the road to the Ogles and tell these stories, and I remember Mrs. Ogle, and this is absolutely true, she did it several times, but the first time she was laughing her head off, and then she just pissed her pants at the table. And then I thought, stories, funny stories have power.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said of David Longy that he used his wit as both shield and sword, or shield?
Yeah. David
was that the same? Is that true of you?
A little bit of that.
Was it a little bit of a defence mechanism?
Yeah, David was once 29 stone, couldn't cross his legs, couldn't step off a chair without worrying about ripping all the ligaments and tendons in his ankle. So there's pictures of David at high school. It looks like the class has two form teachers. No. One form teacher at one end is the teacher. The other person wearing the suit is David, because there wasn't a high school uniform in his size. He had to get a bespoke suit made for him to high school. And he was so grotesquely fat that he made all this noise. You heard David long before you saw him. And he attracted attention. And he'd crack jokes, so it was his way of saying, I'm the centre of attention, not because I'm a figure of pity, someone you should feel sorry for, but someone who's going to be funny and entertaining. And when I had my leg in calipers dragging it to school, and other kids were teasing and joking, and I knew if I started exaggerating my limp, it got more laughs, and that's when I learnt that, hey, if you can use comedy as you can deflect it if you get the joke in first.
But some of these experiences were pretty extreme. I mean, you found out after your father died that he had basically got out a scalpel and removed your face from every family photograph. Yeah. I mean, how do you deal with something like that?
Well, I'm pretty sick and twisted myself. I thought, what a wonderful anecdote. Well, this is worth 4 dinner parties. I couldn't believe it. What I was really gobsmacked was the beautiful precision. It wasn't a savage, furious removal of me. It was carefully done. He actually sent, I toyed with the publisher. He sent a postcard to me after I foolishly appeared on television talking about him. And there was a postcard of a foal and its mum, a mare and a foal, and he'd penciled in on the foal, behind the mother, the mare was having a dump, and there was circles of poo dropping out of its bum, and he put a little arrow to the poo egghead. Then on the other side, he'd give 12 reasons why I detest and loathe egghead. And I've got it. I read it out, and I look at it, and it doesn't bring tears to my eyes. It just wonder how on earth did this venom come from? And I showed it to Avril, and she said, "That's awful. How can you?" She said, "You should burn that." I said, "No, I'm not burning it. That's." But I wondered whether I was going to put it in the book, and I thought if I put it in the book, I'll just be saying, "Look what I had to put up with," and there would be an element of skiting. So I also contemplated when I sent him a book, which I dedicated to my father, who I love but can't remember why. He wiped his arse on it and sent it back, and it came back to me covered in excrement.
Wow.
But I didn't put that in the book either, because I thought I wrote about that. But
so I'm interested in that process of what you decide to put in and what you leave out, and how that conversation happens, given that memoir is such an interesting genre in that obviously it's your story, but it's also necessarily other people's stories, especially when you're talking about family. It's your mother's story, it's your father's story, it's your siblings' stories. I mean, how did you navigate that process, Diana? Let's start with you, of deciding what you can and can't use, to what extent you need to ask permission, and what you leave out.
Yeah, well, I think I've heard other writers talking about this over this festival. I think Jenny Patrick, one of them said, or maybe it was Tina, that the author's note is your friend, and so I've got an author's note saying something along the lines of, this is my personal version of the family story. You need to make it very clear that you're not trying to speak for anyone else, and it's exactly what we were talking about. Every sibling in a family can have a different family. You can't at all assume the experience is the same. But I think when it came to my mother and father, I decided not too much would be off limits about that. In fact, probably, I've recorded some of his autopsy, it's down to the weight of his heart. So I decided that after all those years of not knowing anything, I was going to put as much, which still isn't much, put as much as I know about him in there. And my mother, I think because we'd talked a lot beforehand and before she died, and I think we had a very close relationship. It has made me look at her a little bit differently, the ruthlessness that she had to have to do what she did. And this is where family disagreements can come up, To me, I'm like Tom, that what my mother and father went through. I mean, my mother didn't go through the Holocaust, but she was child of the Depression, family of 8, oldest. She never had a bed to call her own, and if she did get into a bed, it had a toddler weeing in it, And it was, what was that phrase? First up, best dressed in that household. Yeah. And she had a formidable, my nana, really, a woman you wouldn't want to cross. They all had to pretend to vote National. And so she had a tough time, and I'm just not judging her. So that can create difficulties. But for me, I want to tell the truth, but I wanted to make it clear, and I hope I have, that I didn't judge her. But I can wish she did some things differently. The parenting we got was suboptimal for various reasons at times. But she and I were always close. She was always I was lucky I had her as the immovable point of reference. I think if you've got one reasonably functional parent, you're okay. If you've got neither, well, it's really tough. But,
did finding out more about your father and what he'd gone through change the way that you viewed her and also yourself, I guess?
You mean finding out what happened to him after she left? Yeah. Well, I mean, that is a bone of contention. To me, I think I was, from the age of 12, things were really going downhill. And I can remember it was ironic because I was just beginning to really get to know my father, even though he was becoming this strange presence in the household and having these rages where he'd smash his hand on the table, so we had tea stains on the ceiling. We'd just quietly ceased bringing friends home. Didn't really think about it, but just decided that wasn't going to be a good idea. But we started to talk about politics and things, because I hadn't, I was a middle child, kept my head down, tried to avoid trouble, didn't get banished to my room for 6 weeks like my older sister. And so I was beginning to finally develop a relationship with him and kind of admire his mind and things. And at the same time, I'd go and say goodnight to my mother, and she'd be weeping. And she had no one else to talk to, because he wouldn't let her see, well, if she had to sneak out, if she was going to, by this stage, see her old friends, their old friends. She had no money of her own. She was kind of a prisoner in a way. He didn't mean to, but that's how it was playing out. So I remember that. And so, I know what she went through. So I guess her decisions I have to view, he had to escape. She came to a point where she had to escape.
What about you, Tom? You said this morning, I think, that you didn't ask permission, I suppose, of your other siblings, or you didn't ask for their perspective. So how did you navigate that process of the fact that it's your story, but it's also other people's stories?
Well, Sue was worried about the play, The Day-Eyed Atheist,
right.
Sister Sue. And she said, you don't know, it's all right for you, you live in Wellington, you're anonymous. And I said, well, what, I've failed terribly by my God, what a hurtful thing. She said, I'm the Napier, people know who I am, and I'll go down the street and people say, that's the person whose mother couldn't afford knickers and my father was a drunk. And I said, Sue, they won't. People will, you're really funny and charming. Everyone loves you. You're great. It's not going to change anything. If anything, your status will go up. And Sue rang me back a few months later. She said, oh, God, I can't go to a supermarket with people throwing their arms around me. Oh, Sue, you're amazing what you put up with. And, oh, no idea. Oh, and Sue said, you're quite right. It's and Sue is now writing a play of her own. But it's not about the parents, because I've cornered that market. It's a travel. It's a brilliantly funny monologue about a trip she went with a friend, and Sue's a very funny as I said, alluded to before, my family, and it's very funny, it's a slightly vulgar story. We were at a dinner party in Wellington and all people were all there, and somehow or other the subject of anal sex came up. I didn't bring it up, that's for certain. And Sue said, you know, I've never had anal sex on purpose. And so the Scott family are full of people who we just don't behave like normal, reticent, knock the bugger off Kiwis. It's a family full of blurters.
Well, I'm a little scared to ask now, but so what did you leave out?
Pardon?
What did you leave out?
Of my book?
Other than you mentioned those two
I left out, I decided that I had no right to be too honest about, I could be very honest about what happened to me. I mean, I owned up to thinking I had venereal disease and a virgin at the same time. That was a torment from, I won't go into the details here. And I was a wretchedly unhappy person at university because girls are these magical, mystical, exotic girls grow up with themselves. They know there's nothing magical about being a woman, particularly. And but I thought, so I was unhappy and lonely at university. I was the life and soul of every party and very, very lonely. I thought, I have to write about that. But I had when I wrote about when relationships failed, I thought I stole a Bob Dylan line. You're right from your side, I'm right from mine. We're just one too many mornings and 1,000 miles behind. And I just used, so I didn't want my kids to pick it up and read anything negative about their mother or mothers, complicated life, and they haven't. And
right.
And there's been no. The lawyers went through it with a fine-tooth comb, but mostly from what would politicians say, and I didn't mind being. I had to be very careful about Mike Moore and his wife, who behaved very badly on the trip, and we had to tiptoe through that. And Mike Moore's dying now, so give me a few weeks and I can tell you the complete story. But so and David Longy, you couldn't. I was careful to protect politicians who had.
I mean, you made an interesting point this morning, saying that you. I've just completely escaped my brain. No, that when we think about childhood, probably particularly, but memory, the quirk of memory is that we tend to remember the bad stuff, and the joy or the good experiences all kind of blend into one. So I guess, in your memoir, the pictures that you draw of your parents, are they portraits or are they caricatures where you've kind of just grown up?
All I can say is that my brothers and sisters thought they were accurate.
Right.
Rob said, "Oh, you got the old man properly." That's how Rob speaks. And Sue, twin sister Sue, who is much as she's done the only family tree. She went back to Ireland, and I've been back to the cottage where Mum was conceived and born in. Met my relatives. I have to say they were staggeringly stupid and unimpressive. They said, "Well, what do you like about Ireland, Thomas?" "Oh, I'm very fond of Van Morrison." And who would he be?" And my first generation relatives were not, unlike the ones in Northern Ireland with my father, who apparently were very smart. Mum's relatives were. Mum was the brightest knife in the drawer, and so. But Sue went back. She did the family history. And I was worried about if there was any faults in the book, Sue would be the one to spot them, and she couldn't find any. I was pleased.
That either of you regret putting in? I mean, Tom, you did that interview with the TVNZ
yeah.
doco about your father, and
yeah.
I guess everybody that you have showed that to has. I don't know if it's the word shocked, but by your friend, I think, said everything you said was undoubtedly true, but that's not.
I stepped down off the cross and said, "Look at the scars on my hands, and look at the cut in the ribs." I was showing off about what I'd been through, which is not on the scale of what your dad had been through. So it was completely disproportionate self-pity. I went on. It was never supposed to be screened. The psychiatrist wanted to do a thing called On the Couch, and they asked me to be the first person to do it. So it's the first time anyone ever asked me about to talk about my father. And the first time I had talked about him, I told funny stories about my father being funny. Like my father's great quote on parenting. I remember him saying once when some kids were misbehaving, "There is no such thing as a bad parent. There are only bad children." And I thought that was brilliant. I was about 9. I thought, shit, that's a good line. I tucked all these things away. But I'd never talked about my father being an alcoholic and being poor and stuff. And I got carried away. The psychiatrist was quite good, and I was quite loquacious. But I did it on the grounds it would never be broadcast. They interviewed everyone else, all these other New Zealand writers and poets and politicians, and they were all circumspect and guarded and sensible. And they thought, it was all rather dull, really. And we'd like to, use yours. And I foolishly said yes.
Did you regret it?
Yeah, I did, because virtually no one said it was a good idea. I remember showing it to Carol Hirschfeld, who I was hoping to pursue amorously. But she had to resort to morphine in the end. But I showed it to Carol, and I said, "Oh, no, look what I've been through." And Carol, we got about 2 minutes in, and Carol stood up off the sofa and said, "Switch it off." And I said, "Why?" She said, "This is cruel. This is cruel." And another close friend of mine who's a writer said to me, "Tom, you're smashing what's the line, a peanut with a sledgehammer." He said, "Your father is a sick old man in Fielding. You're a well-known New Zealander, and you have publicly punished him and with disproportionate force." And I was like, "Oh, he had it coming," sort of thing. And he said, "No, you behaved badly." And it took me a long time to accept that I had behaved badly. It was a terrible mistake. Though to my father's credit, when he saw it broadcast on TV, he never rang me, ever. And I never rang him, but he never rang us. He never came to weddings. He never came to sports days. Never came to parent-teacher meetings. He never dropped us off anywhere. One dance was one. So I told a quick lie then, corrected myself. But he rang me up out of the blue and said, "Oh, is that you, egghead?" "Yes." "I saw you on the television. You're quite the big man these days. You've been a lot of demand in Auckland and other places north. You'd probably be driving back and forth from Wellington on your way north. It's a long trip in the car. You'd probably thinking that you'd do with a cup of tea. If you're thinking of calling into Fielding for a cup of tea, don't fucking bother." And then hung up. And I was terribly impressed. I thought, geez, he was obviously furious, but the way he set up the punchline was just brilliant. And don't fucking bother. There was just he was a class act.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you wouldn't be who you are, and I wouldn't be who I am if we hadn't.
So do you
had these...
feel conflicted about that? That that's obviously presumably where you got your wit from.
Do I feel grateful to him for?
Or do you feel conflicted about the fact that he was so cruel to you, but at the same time that you perhaps owed him something in your...
It was as much of a given as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That's just who he was. I could see that people, the woman, he was a very handsome man, and the woman and all the other wives in Combolton Road they all had incredibly dull men like Kevin and Neil and Trevor and stuff, and they would call in to have afternoon tea with Mum occasionally, and my father would grab the teapot and say, "I'll be mother, shall I?" And Mum would go, "Ah," nervously, and all the ladies are sitting there, some of them wearing gloves in those days, and all nice, all very nicely done, and now pretty crappy house. And the old man would grab the teapot, he'd say, "I'll be mother," and he'd grab the teapot and he'd whip it right up high and pour the tea into the cups so it splashed everywhere. "What does that remind you of, girls?" "Yellow, hot and steaming, pouring from a tube." And, but making allusions to being urine. And Mum would go, "Oh, isn't he awful, isn't he awful?" And she was in agony, but I could see that they were actually amused by him. I could see that his comedy, cruel and dangerous as it was, did give him a certain power and authority, and he was the centre of attention. He was the centre of attention in every pub he went to as well.
Do we have time for a quick reading before we open the floor? What are we doing for?
But I'm going to sound terribly shallow after her reading. Do you want a shallow reading?
It's an amazing book. It's fantastic.
It is brilliant.
Yeah.
Hilarious.
This is... I I got thrown out of vet school for being stupid. After my ignominious departure from the vet school, I had a year to kill before Massey set up physiology as a stage 3 unit, which I needed to complete a rather tatty Bachelor of Science degree. I did a philosophy paper and a biochemistry paper, but mostly I drew cartoons for the student newspaper Chaff and was judge of a Miss Massey competition held on the cricket oval in front of the refectory. I can picture it now. It was a warm, still evening. The grass was the colour of emerald. The setting sun lent the terracotta Art Deco buildings a pink glow. Young girls, hair and makeup perfect, jewellery sparkling, wearing glamorous gowns, approached the oval in an excited, giggling gaggle, falling silent when they saw the temporary drafting yards that some ag students had set up on the lawn. Guys in black bush singlets, shorts and gumboots, and this was well before Fred Dagg, armed with whistles and rattles and assisted by yapping dogs, rounded them up into holding pen, where they stood ashen-faced until another gate was thrown open, and then with a lot more shouting and barking, they were unceremoniously herded down a narrow race, on either side of which guys in white coats armed with red and blue rattle marked them on the back as they tottered past in their high heels towards a drafting gate to be culled into the clearly identified finalist pens or the ugly pen. Dazed girls fought back tears when they examined ruined ball gowns, not to mention the more permanent, incalculable damage to their self-esteem if they ended up in the ugly pen. I hasten to add here that I was not part of the pre-selection process. I was dressed somberly in a tuxedo, as were the city councillor and the local MP, the rotund and jolly Joe Walding. We merely mingled with the finalists and deliberated in private to declare the winner. I know what you're thinking, and I quite agree. We have gone backwards as a society.
Brilliant. So on that note, I will open the floor for questions. Yes.
When you're writing and it involves family and stories, some of which you think you shouldn't put in, but it's kind of important because it explains so much. And I think you said, Diana, you've got to be ruthless. How do you come to terms, or do you, or are you just at the point, well, stuff it, this is my story, this is how it is, shit happens, deal with it. How do you come to terms with those sorts of issues?
Well, I think exactly as you said, there are some things you put in with a little bit of trepidation because they're true and they explain something or they're important to say. And I think, there is a bit of ruthlessness involved in that but I did think about everything very carefully, and there's a lot that didn't go in the sense that when you start remembering, I don't know if you've had more experience in this, about things, you put a lot down because you remember it. You think, oh, I've forgotten about that, and it has to come back out. But, I think for me, I still wake up at 4 a.m. sometimes and think about a passage and think how it might be read by some relative, So I haven't really come to terms with it, but the only thing I've come to terms with is to decide that was the best I could do at the time with due care. I did try to, and, I remember when I was freaking out and melting down, basically. Poor Chris, he could tell stories about that. But, friends would say, well, you were never cruel. You were never, or I'd ask, are you sure I wasn't mean or whatever? And so I think you try, to do it with a good heart. And, mostly, touch wood. I'm sure the ones that absolutely hate it haven't been in touch, but... has been too bad.
It might be guilt. I know for me, it was validation when other people said, "Oh, that was their favourite part," and yet for immediate family, it was like, "Why did you put that?" Kind of illustrated a point, but you kind of
Yeah, and I mean, I did do it belatedly after it was too late to do anything about it. I thought, why didn't I think of doing this? You know, writing a family memoir and then on Google. This is what not to do. Oh, shit. why didn't I read this at the beginning? But the range was very wide. I don't know, you know, on one hand it said, it's your story, you're allowed to tell it, you know, don't defame anyone and don't get sued. But beyond that, and, you know, one writer had the answer, you know, you shouldn't have said that about your sister or whatever. Well, she shouldn't have been such a bitch.
Well, the way you said I'd get sued, and as it was ACC, I said, oh, stuff it, I was going to leave it in.
Good on you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yep.
I'm interested because I think that your story is about pain and families, and so your pain that you've experienced is from your family. So how do your children and your grandchildren, what do they take from what you've done, and do they carry this pain, or have you put a full stop on that?
No. I'm sure not. No. I think, yes, I think, I mean, part of what this book is how it affects everyone down through generations. And as is being proven now, still a little bit up in the air, but epigenetically, things get passed down, don't they? And I don't know how you feel about your kids, whether...
The children, only one of them's read it, and the others, I haven't discussed it with them. They're very proud of the fact that I can run her up to Diane and
Sorry.
they're very happy for me. Will, who's actually not my flesh and blood, as my mum said of him, my Irish mother said, Avril and I have a blended family, and Mum said, there's something about that cat Will. He's not my flesh and blood, but he's something special. And Will, because he's not my flesh and blood, he's the only one that's read it and commented on it. And he said, well done. He said, that's terrific. And he said, I learnt a lot about New Zealand reading it, which he enjoyed the history of it. Sam and Rosie said, well done, Dad. And they came to the launch. Sam is in the Phoenix Foundation, his lead singer, and a very gifted and sensitive boy. I think I haven't asked, but I think they've made a pact. My suspicion is they've said to Mum, we're not discussing it with Dad, and we're not discussing it with you. I think that's what's happened. There's been some sort of Pax Britannica where it's not going to be discussed. And my older boy in Britain, Sean, Big Sean, he's in Britain, and I had to bring him a copy, so I left him a copy, and I'll get round to reading this. I did read him one line when I was looking after him. The day he was born, I floated back I went back to teaching the same morning he was born. I was determined to be the best dad ever I could be, and certainly better than my father. And when I was older, I said to Mum one day, I was close to tears. So I don't think I was always the best dad to Sean. I feel bad about that. I don't think I was the best dad I could have been to Sean. And I was hoping for some sort of affirmative action from Mum. No, you weren't. You were a piss poor dad to that poor child. Fuck, that's not what I was hoping. You let him down badly.
So when
I told Sean this line, and he's, that's Nana, and he just pissed himself laughing. And, but I have an unbelievable capacity to forgive myself. It's
So when's Sean's memoir coming out?
Yes, what about that?
We maybe have time for one more, yeah?
When my sister and I discussed our childhood, we had completely different versions of the same event, to the point where I do not trust my memory of my childhood at all. I'm wondering if then in the process of writing your memoirs, you sort of were writing events or about, the people in your life, and you suddenly stop and go, hang on, do I have this right? Or this can't possibly have happened like I remember it. Did you ever sort of doubt your memories?
Yeah, from time to time. I think that it's like anything, isn't it? The more you think about a word, it seems absurd, and the more you think about a memory, you're not sure someone told it to you or you remember it. But the good thing about my story is, with my father, it was always strange from the time I was a baby. there was always a sense of things not being quite right. And so I feel like I do. I mean, I know I have forgotten some things, but a lot of the interactions we had, which, you know, were significant, are burnt into my memory. So I do feel like with those ones, I remember well, pretty well for me in that relationship. But yeah, in my family, it's more interpretation of events. We might remember the same thing, but we'll interpret it entirely differently. And that's where the conflict, and you can't really do much about that, really. I have moved in my thinking. It has taught me, you know, things that seemed, that no one's right about these things, and it's no good, you know, you have to find a way not to try and be right about these things. And I've shifted and seen things from a different point of view. It's been really good, and I've tried to convey that. You know, I hope that you do shift.
I'm so deaf I didn't hear the question. So roughly what was she asking?
Basically just, I guess, the fallibility of memory, and did you have situations in which you doubted your own memory, and perhaps especially when it conflicted with other people's memories?
Memory is terribly elastic and fragile, and we can reinforce. Prisons are full of people who never committed crimes now. If you tell yourself over and over again, I did not strangle that child, or did not, your brain goes, well, have it your way. I remember vividly when Nelson Mandela came to New Zealand, he wanted to thank the New Zealand press for the role we played. And I remember on the Listener, there were great writers like Tony Reid and Jeff Chappell and Phil Gifford and Gordon Campbell. And the Listener was virtually an anti-apartheid magazine, you know, and I was really proud of them in the Listener. And I was out there being a reporter trying to write about apartheid while being strongly opposed to it. When Nelson Mandela came to New Zealand, he wanted to speak at the Press Gallery's 100th birthday. Jim Bolger was furious because but Nelson Mandela wanted to thank the New Zealand press. And I have a vivid memory of Rosie being in the choir that sang, what's that, Nicolese book? I'm dyslexic. What's your beautiful South African national anthem? And he went up and thanked every singer. And I have this memory of Rosie crying in the front row while Nelson Mandela thanked her. And I said to Rosie, remember that Nelson Mandela thanked you? She said, Dad, I wasn't in that choir. And I go, Jesus, how much of everything else have I invented?
Well, it was a great piece of fiction anyway.
Yeah.
Good story.
So no one knows how much. The Scott family is oral. There's no records. There's hardly any photographs, and there's certainly no records. My birth certificate's gone because all my kids and relatives wanted a British birth certificate, so years ago, I don't have a birth certificate now. It's been farmed out so many times, it's gone. I hope I don't ever need it again anyway. But so there's no. I was staggered at the amount of manuscripts and stuff that you managed to unearth. Nothing on our side of the family. But we are all verbal. So there's a great oral tradition, and so my falsehoods have probably been from what I've heard rather than misreading.
Fascinating. Well, look, there's so much more that I could talk about and that we could ask, but we have unfortunately run out of time. So both Tom and Diana will be around for book signings afterwards, but if you would just like to join me in thanking them for an amazing session. Thank you.